more than a woman. More than a woman to me. More than a woman. More than a woman to me. Okay, Google, stop. That is not something I thought I would ever find myself doing when I started this podcast. I hope you people appreciate the lengths I go to keep you entertained. I actually thought that was a perfect song to start this show because today is all about Dido, Queen Dido, goddess queen almost of Carthage. She, if anybody ever was, is more than a woman. And what we have to talk about today is the meeting between Aeneas and Dido. We've been building up to it, and it's going to take us a couple episodes, I think, to really grapple with everything that this means. Virgil expertly introduces us to this magnificent woman, this woman who's like a goddess, who's almost descended from heaven, something ethereal, a vision that Aeneas, after having washed up bedraggled on shore, is likely to fall head over heels in love with. And what we are, in fact, on the verge of is truly, in every sense of the term, an epic romance. It's a tragic romance, and we know that from the outset because of everything we talked about last week. We know that the conflict between Rome and Carthage, which is represented in these two people, this storm-tossed founder of what will become Rome and this refugee queen of what is now Carthage, we know that that's standing in for this cataclysmic confrontation between Rome and Carthage, which made Rome what it now is in Virgil's day, which is an empire. And the way that Virgil does this, we've talked about this last week, is that he takes the grand God's eye view of things, the retrospective history of it all, knowing now, looking back from imperial Rome, that this story was the beginning of what would become a great nation and a great empire. He tells us that story from the point of view of the gods, but from the point of view of the human beings, he tells it in this very tender, vulnerable drama of things that seem random at the time, of desperation and heartache and uncertainty. And the combination of those two things is never more poignant than it is in this meeting and ultimate love affair between Aeneas, Prince of Troy, someday founder of Rome, and Queen Dido of Carthage. So that's what we're going to start to get into today. It is one of the great love stories, tragic love stories in literature. If you don't end up crying at the end of this story, I don't know what to tell you. You need to go and watch The Notebook or something and get in the mood to tell this story, because this is the doomed romance, the doomed love affair of the male Rome. Remember that the man, Aeneas, is the Roman one, and that's important because Rome is the masculine, manly society, and it is presided over, even though Venus is the mother of Aeneas, Zeus is the one who is ultimately presiding. The king of the gods is the one who has it in mind for this thing to end up with Aeneas in Italy founding Lavinium, which will become Rome, or generate the line of kings that will lead to Rome. And then on the other side of that, Juno, his wife, the woman, is cherishing Carthage. She loves Carthage, this Phoenician empire, this North African, new at the time of the poem. It's a new colony that's going to rise up and become, throughout the history of Rome, it's going to become the great empire of the Mediterranean. These seafaring peoples, the Phoenicians, and they are feminine. They are led by a queen, and that's something that Virgil is going to make much of. Queen Dido has come here, and Juno is their patron. And there is this male-female tension, sexual tension, opposition between these two things, and not just in the sense of, well, Rome is the manly man and therefore has to stride forth, although that is part of it. But this is not any weak, retiring flower that represents Carthage. Dido is by no means a kind of fainting, effeminate woman in the sense that we might assume if we were just going off of stereotypes and caricatures. She's actually kind of an Amazon. She's kind of a femme fatale. And the woman that she stands in for in history, most of all, besides Dido, besides herself, the woman that she stands in for is Cleopatra, the femme fatale of maybe all of history, but certainly of Roman history and very recent Roman history for Virgil. Cleopatra was at the center of the civil wars between Mark Antony and Octavian, who would eventually become Emperor Augustus, and she is portrayed in ancient literature as this almost divine, kind of supernatural force, this force of nature that brings kingdoms to ruin and brings great men to their knees. And Dido is that. Dido has all of that power, but she also is a very, very lovable character. And that's a bold and daring move for Virgil to pull off. That's something which we might not expect him to do, and if he were a less courageous artist, he probably wouldn't have done it. The easy thing to do here would be to go for Carthage as the kind of wimpy, effeminate, and Asiatic kind of queendom, because that's where they come from. They come from Tyre, which is in what now is modern-day Lebanon, and so they would count as Easterners, and there were a lot of ideas in Rome about the East as this place of corrupting luxury and feminine influence. And the Phoenicians were a fabulously wealthy people. They were a maritime empire, a trading empire, a commercial empire. So the really easy thing to do here would be for Dido to come on stage as a kind of weak woman. And she is going to be brought to her knees. But the other thing we have to remember, of course, is that Carthage started out in Roman history as the pinnacle of conquering triumph. And so we can't begin with Dido as too easy a foil. She can't just flop over into Aeneas' arms instantly. We have to see her at the height so that she can have the tragic fall. And to really invite us into that and to give us a sense of the tragedy as well as the destiny is what makes Virgil great. This is what makes Virgil a great artist. And this is why when people start to say, well, is Virgil in favor of Rome or is he against Rome? Is he happy about Augustus or is he sad about Augustus? I just think it's entirely the wrong set of questions, because both of these things are obviously present. They're obviously real. Yes, Rome had to come into being. Yes, this was a plan, a divine plan. Yes, we're glad that the empire is great and grand and it is amazing, but terrible, terrible things had to be lost, and personal allegiances, personal love had to be put aside, and people were ruined in the process of it, and that's part of the story too. But first, if you're anything like me, you like to eat healthy, you want to take care of your body, but you also love a cheat meal every now and then. Personally, my favorite thing on a Sunday when we have movie night with our friends is I like to lay out a giant cheese board, charcuterie for days. If you've ever seen me post these on Instagram, we got cheddar, we got feta, we got pimento, we got all the spreadables, and of course, we got the bagels. Now, is this, strictly speaking, part of my daily diet? No, and I couldn't eat like that every day. But I want to be able to eat like that sometimes, and you shouldn't have to give that sort of stuff up in order to feel good about your diet, which is why you need Field of Greens. Field of Greens is going to lay down a base layer for your diet. What this does is it gives you that serving of fruits and vegetables that you need every day so that you can feel good about the basic structure of the nutrition that you're getting, and that leaves you a little bit of wiggle room here and there so that you can have a cheese board every now and then, or even, God forbid, a cheeseburger or a pizza or whatever you like. You can have something every now and then to mix it up without feeling like you've completely blown up your diet. Field of Greens has a bunch of different options depending on your goals. There's a heart health group, there's lungs and kidney groups, there's one dedicated to metabolism, one even for healthy weight, and they all have great benefits that come along with them. Personally, I just feel a lot more energized with Field of Greens without having to do a bunch of caffeine. I feel like it kind of gives me that basic energy that I need to get through the day. But there's a ton of different benefits, and it's so good for your health that they make the Better Health promise that your doctor will notice your improved health if you use Field of Greens every day, or you get your money back. But I don't think you're going to want it. I've got you a special discount just for my listeners, 20% off your first order when you use the offer code HERETICS, HERETICS, at fieldofgreens.com. That's offer code HERETICS, HERETICS, at fieldofgreens.com. This is a must-have tool for making your diet optimal in 2025 without having to give up all the foods you love. One more time, it's fieldofgreens.com, offer code HERETICS. You got to go check it out. So we're going to just start getting acquainted with Dido here today. We're not going to get finished with it. I'm going to keep this up for a while because there's a variety of different things we have to cover, but I want to pick up where we left off, and that was after the storm. Remember, I read that ekphrasis, that long description of what Carthage looks like, and this sense that we have of welcome and foreboding. This is both a safe harbor out of the storm that Juno had created, but it's also out of the frying pan into the fire, because this is Juno's beloved place. This is Carthage, and it is haunted by nymphs. It's full of supernatural entities. And that's where we stopped, and where we will now pick up with Aeneas and his right-hand bro, Achates, who's one of my favorite characters. He's always kind of at Aeneas' right side, and they go exploring together. They go to scout out what's up in this new land, and it's a very Odyssean scene. In the Odyssey, Odysseus and his pals are always washing up somewhere on shore and having to go and send a scout, or Odysseus has to go himself and check out what kind of men and people are here. What sort of race is it that we are looking at? And this is what they do. They go looking for where they can find food and shelter, and whether there's civilization here or what. And they're doing the Odyssey thing when who should they run into? Whom should they encounter? But none other than the goddess Venus. And she's in disguise. She's in disguise as a young maiden out hunting. And this is one of the big scenes from this first book of the poem. We're still in book one of the Aeneid. There's tons of paintings of this moment. I'll throw one up. If you're watching on YouTube, I'll put one on the screen. And there's a bunch of different images that you can look at of this moment with Venus in disguise. And of course, Venus is Aeneas' mother. She's therefore a hugely important figure. She's his closest line to the gods. She's his direct line to divinity and to the plans, the kind of cosmic register, to which otherwise he seems to have basically no access. He's kind of at a loss. He's kind of at sea, literally and metaphorically, and he's casting about for some hint about where to go, what to do, and Venus is his easiest sort of access point to that, except she's a little bit of a distant mother, and Aeneas reproaches her for this when he pretty quickly figures out who she is. So this is this meeting between the two of them. It's one of the passages, and this is one of the things that makes doing this show about Aeneas and the Aeneid, this is so fun for me, because this is one of the first things I ever read in Latin, in the original Latin, was Virgil's Aeneid. And I did it in high school, and I did it in AP Latin. If you guys are in high school now, or if you have kids in high school, you know about these advanced placement classes. And I actually haven't done any high school teaching, so I don't know how much this is still true. But at the time, if you wanted to get a 5 on the AP exam, which was the highest mark, if you really wanted to ace it and get your scores up to snuff for applying to the best colleges, you had to repeat and repeat and repeat all of these passages. It wasn't the whole Aeneid that you had to know how to translate, but they had a selection of passages that you had to translate. It was a lot of lines of Latin, and you just had to drill it into your head. And so now, whenever I'm reading the poem again to do it for the show and to talk to you guys about it, whenever I come across one of these passages, it's like primal sense memory, muscle memory just kicks in, and I'm very much back in high school, and I'm translating this passage, and I feel like I haven't forgotten a word of it. So this is one of the passages, this meeting between Aeneas and his mother, that is always front and center on the AP exam, or at least it used to be. It was one that we could kind of rely on, and I actually think it showed up on my personal AP exam. So I have a long and deep history with that. Teenage Spencer, nerdy, pimply Spencer, who I guess is not actually all that different from nerdy current Spencer, but nerdy teenage Spencer was very invested in this passage and making sure he got all the different verb forms right and all the vocabulary right. And now that I'm coming back to it with many, many more years of study under my belt, I can kind of appreciate what an interesting thing Virgil is doing here, because we always have to keep Homer in the backs of our minds, right? As we're reading the Aeneid, always have to think that Virgil is trying to play with Homer, trying to move to surpass him, to transcend him in some respects, but also to borrow some of his glory. And there is kind of an interesting problem, therefore, that Virgil has to deal with, which is that in the Iliad and the Odyssey, Venus, that is Aphrodite in the Greek, the goddess of love, who's called Venus in this version, is kind of a ridiculous figure. She's sort of one of the comic relief gods, and she's not this grand, majestic spectacle person that like Juno is, right? Juno is in the best Roman and Greek tradition, the best epic tradition, a force to be reckoned with. And same with Poseidon or Neptune, the god of the sea. These are serious, formidable powers in the world. Aphrodite, not so much. I mean, we're used to seeing her getting wounded on the battlefield and going crying to daddy, going to Zeus and having all these kind of pouty moments. And there's a lot of funny episodes in both the Iliad and the Odyssey with Aphrodite. She's an adulteress. She sleeps with the god Mars, the god of war, when she's married to Hephaestus or Vulcan, the god of the smith, the god of metalworking. And in general, she's not one of the gods that we think of as most imposing. In fact, she kind of exists to bridge the gap between the human and the divine. And she does do that here too. She is the connection between Zeus, the All-Father, the kind of masculine force that is driving history and making the ultimate decisions. She's the connection between that and Aeneas, who is at the moment coming across as kind of a dweeb. And so Venus has to perform this delicate task of guiding her son, but also she can't be the figure of fun and mockery that she is a lot of the time in Homer, for the important reason that if Venus is Aeneas linked to the divine, she's also Augustus linked to the divine. And so if I were Virgil, I would be getting a little bit hot under the collar at this point and thinking, how am I going to take this figure from the epic tradition and I'm going to put her into my poem as the representative, the closest relative from Olympus for the current ruler of the world, for Augustus. And he does it by taking that Venus kind of in-between figure, taking this god that tends to travel between the divine and the human realm, and placing her in all of these positions that are occupied in Homer by other goddesses. So we've already seen that happen one time when Venus goes to Zeus and begs him to save Aeneas from the storm and to ensure and to guarantee his future. Now, this is a classic Homer thing for the goddess of love to be whining or pleading with her dad, with Zeus, but it's also something that happens to other goddesses in the Iliad, most importantly Thetis. And Thetis, who's less important in the hierarchy of gods, is nevertheless the mother of Aeneas. And so in that way, she's kind of the Venus of the Iliad, because she's the mother of the hero of the poem. Venus is the mother of the hero of this poem, and so she gets to take on a role that is a little bit more dignified. Thetis famously in the Iliad pleads with Zeus to ensure the fate of her son and to vouchsafe his glory and to defend and protect the promises that have been made about his fate from Olympus. And that's what Venus starts out by doing. We first meet her asking Zeus to confirm what he has already effectively said, which is that Aeneas is guaranteed a glorious future. And he is guaranteed that, and we know that from the outset, but there is a lot of pain on the way. And so Venus has to come to kind of reassure and to guide and to direct. And when she does that, when she comes down from Mount Olympus, she's very much in the role of Athena from the Odyssey. And so Virgil is very, very subtly taking this comic goddess and casting her in all of these noble, elevated roles from Homer so that she gets a dignity that she doesn't always have in Homer. And so now when we meet her this time, when she encounters Aeneas in Carthage, she's really playing the role of Athena from the Odyssey. We're now squarely in the Odyssey. We're in the Odyssey portion of the poem, which is the first 6 books. And Venus is very much in the role of Athena, who, if you listened to my series on Homer and the Odyssey, you will remember that Athena was the goddess guide. She was the one that took an interest in Odysseus and shaped and directed his journey. And she shows up here in much the same way. Athena is often in disguise. Venus is in disguise here. And she is often intensely involved while keeping a certain degree of distance, which is something that Aeneas finds very, very painful. Aeneas kind of takes on his role as long-suffering hero here because he doesn't get to have this direct relationship with his mother, even though he really wants it, even though he's constantly asking for her to kind of take off her disguise. And she's like, Venus? Who's that? I don't know anything about Aphrodite. In much the same way that Athena is often shielding herself from view until the decisive moment when she kind of gives the game away. And so it's big Ithaca hours right now. It's really reminiscent of the moment when Odysseus washes up on shore of his home island and has to figure out how he's going to reintegrate himself into the palace. Here, Aeneas has washed up on a foreign shore, the shore of Carthage, and he needs help to understand what kinds of people these are and how he can best use them, essentially, to his advantage. What he doesn't foresee, what he can't foretell, is that in the process of trying to get on his own way, he is going to catch the feels. He's going to get kind of wrapped up in this emotional relationship, which he then is going to have to give up in order to move forward to his destiny and to found Lavinia. But all of that is in the future. Right now, what we need is information. And so Virgil also uses Venus here for exposition, to give a kind of expo dump and tell us about who these people are, and to tell us Dido's own story, which is a feature of myth already. He doesn't invent this myth, although he certainly gives us a version of it that becomes kind of authoritative. But he tells us the story of how Dido fled from Tyre to go to Carthage. So she started out as princess of Tyre. She was the sister of the king, whose name was Pygmalion, and her husband, Dido's husband, Sichaeus, was the wealthiest in all the land, which is a big deal because it's a wealthy, wealthy land. Tyre is almost a byword for wealth in ancient literature. That's true here, certainly, in the story of Dido and in the Aeneid. It's also true in the Bible. If you're a reader of the Old Testament, you'll have come across Tyre, and maybe you just kind of skipped over it the way you skip over a lot of those other names of things. But Tyre is a name for wealth. It's in Lebanon, which is also generally known for its material abundance. It's often sending resources to friendly kings in Israel. And it's often paired with Tarshish, which is a city that I had to stop myself from doing too much research about because it's a giant, fun wormhole in scholarship. Tarshish and Tyre are often named next to one another in the Bible. If you've spent a lot of time in the prophecies of Isaiah, you might remember Isaiah 23, Tyre is named as the crowning city, and it's often Tyre and Tarshish that are sort of paired with one another. There's a lot of scholarly debate about where Tarshish was. Many people seem to think it was in Spain. This place called Tartessus is perhaps the place that most naturally fits, but there are other candidates like in Sardinia and so forth. Anyway, it's a whole thing that I didn't have time to go down. If you're really interested in it, send me a mailbag question at rejoiceevermore.substack.com and we can talk more about Tyre and Tarshish. But the top line item here is just that this is a kingdom that is well known for its wealth. It's in what we now know as Lebanon. It's also near another city called Sidon, and Sidon is something, if you're reading the poem at home, you may come across Dido referred to as Sidonian Dido. And that's because all of these names are kind of synonyms in the Virgil. For the purposes of Virgil, for the Romans, this is all just a big, luxurious eastern place where they have a lot of money and wealth, and that fits with the contemporary, that is in Virgil's day, the contemporary understanding of Carthage as this maritime commercial empire with all of these material resources. And so that's kind of the setting, the backdrop for Dido, warrior princess, because the story we get is an adventure story of how Dido, raised in the lap of luxury as the princess of Tyre, has to flee after her brother, Pygmalion, kills her husband, Sichaeus, and he does it out of greed. Pygmalion is the archetypal luxurious Eastern king who is addicted to material wealth, wants the wealth that Sichaeus has, and kills him for it. And this is the inciting incident for Dido to flee. So we get this story told to us by Venus. It's a great story, and whenever we have excellent Virgilian verse, I want as much as possible to translate it for you and read from the original, so that's what I've done here. This is a section of that story. After Pygmalion, the evil miser king, has killed Sichaeus, the wealthy man married to Pygmalion's sister Dido, then Sichaeus, the dead husband, comes to Dido, the warrior princess, in a dream. She has a dream of her dead husband, and this is how it goes. He says, in her dreams, and this is, remember, Venus is narrating. So, in her dreams there came the very form of him, her husband, not long buried, rearing his ghostly head, his iron-punctured chest, the brutal altar deed. He was killed by the altar, which is particularly sacrilegious. He laid it bare, the secret evil of the house, uncovered everything, and urged her to escape. No time to waste. To help her on her way, a secret, hidden treasure, ancient in the earth, a fund of gold and silver, massed in quantities unknown. Shaken, Dido prepared companions and escape. Now, a few different things to note here. I'm translating into loose Alexandrines. We are in dactylic hexameter in the original, which is the meter of Homer and of epic generally. It's 6 groupings of syllables, 6 feet, and each one is either a dactyl, which is long, short, short, da, 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 or a spondy, long, long, da, 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 that sort of thing. There's no really comfortable way to translate that into English epic. Often people will use iambic pentameter, which is da, 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 da. That's the meter of English epic, like, for example, Milton. C.S. Lewis, who worked throughout his life on a translation of the Aeneid, used the Alexandrian, and he did a rhyming version, which I think is a little bit too archaic, especially for us now. But the 6-foot line, which is what a 12-syllable line is, 12 iambs basically gives you a rough Alexandrine. I have found that to be very helpful for translating Virgil. That's what I'm doing here. But in her dreams there came the very form of him, her husband, not long buried, rearing his ghostly head. And then there are all sorts of things in the Latin that you have to pay attention to in translation, some of which you can get and some of which you can't. There is also, and this is my favorite thing to nerd out about, there is also a figure of speech in here that you can capture in translation. Figures of speech are where you use language in some sort of rhetorical or artistic way that's different from the usual, most direct possible way of speaking. And this was another big AP Latin thing, is you had to learn the names of figures of speech. They all have names from the ancient world. I told you one last time. Ekphrasis is an example of this. That's the name for a long breakout description of a place or a work of art. And I'm actually really curious whether you guys like to know these names of figures of speech, whether it was helpful for you to learn about ekphrasis, because, man, I love it. I cannot get enough of figures of speech and the ancient theory of figures of speech. So I got a whole sack of them just ready to go. If you're interested, if you like them, please do write in and let me know at rejoiceevermore.substack.com. Or you can write in and say, it's kind of distracting. I just want to hear about the story. I want to hear about Dido and Sichaeus and all of that. I really like figures of speech. So if you're interested in them, let me know and I'll keep telling you about them. They're very, very useful. And I think they're important because they allow you to see how Virgil, as a written poet, is carefully crafting his meaning. So let me know in the comments or in at Rejoice Evermore whether you're interested in this stuff and whether you want more of it. Also, if you haven't yet, please hit that subscribe button wherever you're listening. Apple Podcasts, Google, Spotify, YouTube, wherever you are, you can just subscribe. And this is a series on the Aeneid, so you don't want to miss an episode. We're going to go through the whole poem together. Just hit that subscribe button. And if you're a fan, if you like this stuff, do rate it 5 stars. Let people know that you're enjoying it, and let me know, because that really, really helps me. Okay, let's talk about another figure of speech that's going on here. It's called Zeugma, and the names themselves are just so good. Zeugma is a Greek name that means yoking two things together. And the example that we have here of Zeugma is Dido prepared companions and escape. And it's in the Latin. Dido fugam sociosque parabat. She was preparing, or she got ready, fuga, which is flight, that is escape, and Sokii, that is companions or friends that can go with her on her journey. And just like Aeneas, who has recently had to escape from the falling of Troy, Dido also has to escape because it's very likely that she is up next on the chopping block for this evil tyrant Pygmalion. And so this is a wonderful instance of economy in Virgil's composition. Virgil, as I've said before, is a very dense, compact poet, and he's able to be that way in part because he's writing. And he uses these figures of speech to just rocket the story along and to give you a lot in every word. So you notice here, he just told this gory, gruesome story of this visitation. The corpse, the buried corpse of Dido's husband appears to her in a dream and shows her his iron punctured chest, his pectora, his chest that has been pierced by the iron of the sword and the blade. And then he says, you gotta go because Pygmalion is evil, he's crazy, there's no telling what he'll do next, and there's a big stash of buried treasure. It gets to the end of that dream, and Virgil doesn't even say Dido woke up. He just moves right on, shaken. Dido prepared companions and escape. Instant scene change, suddenly kind of breakneck change of pace, and he just says, his komota, moved by these things, shaken by these things. Because you'll notice that parabat, the verb, applies to two different objects. It has the object fuga, she was preparing flight or escape, and she was preparing companions. And the word itself, the verb to prepare, kind of has two different meanings for those two different objects. Even though Virgil only has to say it once, he gives you the sense of two different actions. To prepare an escape is to make physical provisions. She's getting the material she needs and everything. Virgil's kind of using that as shorthand for all of the logistics that Dido has to deal with. To prepare your companions is to wake them up, to talk to them, to let them know, to prepare them for a journey emotionally, spiritually, mentally. And so that's a different sense of the word parare, or to prepare. And we can get this in the English when we say Dido prepared companions and escape. We get two separate ideas of the word prepare. So there's a lot going on in that little tiny section. And that's the use of the zeugma, which is to use one verb, it's usually a verb, in two different ways. So the example I always use is the farmer grew beans and board. The English verb grew can be an intransitive verb. He grew bored, meaning he became bored, but it can also be a transitive verb, meaning he caused things to grow as a farmer. He grew beans and he grew bored, waiting for the beans to grow. So that's zeugma, and Virgil uses it here. It's very closely related to another figure of speech called hendiadys, which is where you yoke two things together. Hendiadys means two in one, and it's where you would usually have some sort of subordinate clause, but instead you use a conjunction. So the sound and the fury, two different things linked in one, instead of furious sound or something like that. Dieu est mon droit. This is the UK's motto, God and my right. I hit him good and hard instead of very hard or something like that. Good and hard is an example of hendiadys, and that's closely related but not the same thing as zeugma. Again, if this is boring you to tears, let me know and I won't do any more figures of speech. But I think these are awesome, and I think if we taught them to advanced English students, they would be much better writers because it makes you aware of the way that you're using language. But having done this little interlude, we'll call this the figure of speech interlude, rhetorical interlude, we should have a little music. Rhetorical interlude. Do-do-do-do. And now we're back to the story. They're getting ready to leave. They're fleeing from this evil tyrant king who just wants more and more money. He's insatiable and he's going to kill them if they don't leave. So off they go. And she gathers her companions, and what Virgil tells us next is who came. Who is this group of people? Because that's the group of people we're about to meet in Carthage. They came, whoever seethed with hatred for the tyrant or whose fear was sharp enough. This is kind of anticipating Machiavelli. Anybody that hates or fears the tyrant enough is ready to leave. They grabbed what ships they happened to find ready, loaded them with gold, and they were off. The riches of the miser king Pygmalion at sea. A woman led the deed. That last little quick tag, a woman led the deed, is very much Virgil putting his finger on it. It's nailing the driving the nail home, whatever metaphor you want to use. He's just really kind of reminding us, Dux Femina Facti. This is a mission that is led by a woman, and she is a woman up to the task. She's a formidable kind of femme fatale, and that same series of words, those three words, Dux Femina Facti, could easily also have applied to Cleopatra. Cleopatra, leader of the Ptolemies, leader of Egypt, this other grand African kingdom. The similarities are endless, and Virgil means for us to see them. So we have here a hugely imposing queenly figure that we are about to meet. And so the tension is mounting. We know this is happening. Off they go. They've learned this. Venus has done her job, so she floats back up into the sky. And Aeneas and Achates go off further scouting. They're on their way to learn more. The first thing they encounter, and this is like Danger Will Robinson times 2, next after the ekphrasis, this is going to be another indicator that things are not exactly as they ought to be. They're going to run right into a temple to Juno. Juno, the arch nemesis of Aeneas, the goddess who is dead set on his disaster, on his failure, on his death, is now being worshipped here at Carthage with this grand and beautiful temple. And we're going to save that part for next time. We're going to come back to that next time because it needs its own treatment. The temple of Juno gets a separate ekphrasis, another long description that requires kind of its own thing because it's got like a little mini Iliad on it and it's got all sorts of stuff. That's very, very famous passage. But for now, all you need to know is Aeneas has just been told about this refugee queen who is building her new civilization. She's a very formidable woman. She's got all this wealth that she took from her dead husband who told her where it was buried. And now she's building this incredible temple. Here they are in the midst of this new and bustling city. And the temple is to Juno. This is a problem. It doesn't seem to bother Aeneas nearly as much as it should. And we see it as sinister in a way that Aeneas doesn't quite yet. And that's part of the effect that Virgil is going for, I think, that Aeneas is in a story, but he doesn't quite know what story he's in. We know, because we've got the God's Eye view as well, and we know that this is a major and dangerous civilization that is about to come into clash and conflict. We also know that this femme fatale has all these resonances with Cleopatra, and so we should probably be a little bit wary about it. But Aeneas seems pretty happy-go-lucky. He's like, wow, look at this amazing place. Like, he's a little bit jealous that they've already founded a new city. He's like, this place seems awesome. Look at all these walls. Look at this amazing stuff. It's a little more complicated than that. We'll get into it. But basically, Aeneas is walking right into a trap here. I hesitate to say a honey trap, but he's really kind of like about to set his foot into a net. So, unbeknownst to her, is Dido. And that's the tragic part of this whole story, that the two of them are actually both in their own way walking in blind to something that is going to cost both of them dearly. And neither of them really quite knows, and Dido here is at the pinnacle of her powers. We've been told about her in a kind of vulnerable moment. We've heard about her escape from Tyre, having to sail west from Lebanon to get here. And so we've heard that she's a refugee. We've heard that she's like Aeneas, kind of cast out of her homeland by fate. But now we've seen that she's really made quite a go of it. She's got the resources that she brought from her homeland. She's amazingly well stocked, and she's doing great work bringing everybody together and leading them in the founding of this city. And so the next thing that happens right after Aeneas has seen everything that's going well, the stage is set, everything is ready, the tension is mounting, and Dido makes an entrance worthy of a queen. She is, as I think the kids would say these days, she is mother. And I maybe mean that literally because the first thing that happens is we get a comparison between Dido and a goddess. So we maybe are supposed to think there's something a little bit almost creepy or psychosexual going on, except probably not really because Venus is not the goddess that she gets compared to. But there's still this sense that just as we've just seen Venus, this beautiful goddess, this regal, young, huntress, virgin-looking woman, disguised, right? I mean, Venus was kind of putting that on as a disguise, that she was going to be this virginal huntress type, and that she was... The idea that she's a virgin is itself kind of wry on Virgil's part. But now we get Dido, who really is in that role of Diana, the goddess of the hunt, even though she has a prior husband. He's dead, she's a widow, and she is stepping into this role of the huntress goddess. So it's amazing how Virgil does it here, that he gives us all the epic grandeur, but nothing is ever quite as it seems. Dido is the virgin goddess, but she's actually a widow. Venus is disguised as this virgin maiden, but she's actually the goddess of love. The whole landscape is seeped in sexual tension underneath this veneer of prim and chaste beauty. And so we get the kind of menace of the thing and the danger that Aeneas is stepping into, of the allure that he's about to get trapped in, this love nest that he's walking into, at the same time as we see how beautiful and pure and wonderful everything Dido is doing. And it's very, very sly on Virgil's part that he's preparing, foreshadowing all of the sexual allure that Cleopatra had and all of the desire that Aeneas is going to fall into, at the same time as he's giving us these huntress scenes and this image of Dido as goddess Diana, the goddess of the hunt, and the virginal goddess of the hunt, very importantly. And so this is a place where it becomes almost impossible to translate what Virgil does here. The first line that we get when Dido shows up on the scene is one of Virgil's, I think, most beautiful lines: "Reginad templum forma pulcherrima Dido." And you can hear, even if you don't know Latin, that Dido is the last word in the line. And the first three words, regina ad templum, which in the poetry is going to be reginad templum, they are in themselves a kind of masterpiece of regal stateliness. And they're almost impossible to translate in the way that they need to be translated because there's no verb. Virgil is saving the verb for the next line. This is another figure of speech called enjambment, where you draw the meaning of the sentence over the line of poetry when it crosses over into two lines. That's called enjambment. It's also, there's a yet, I guess, third figure of speech involved here, and that is hyperbaton. Now, hyperbaton is where the meaning of the sentence is kind of split. You start out with these concepts that don't yet have a full grammatical meaning. Regina ad templum, the queen to the temple. And it's something like if you said the queen before her temple or something, the queen unto her temple. And then later on, we're going to get the queen unto her temple came. And in a bit, we're going to get the queen who was Dido, but all of it is delayed. It's all kind of making us wait for the key moment to see her. And first we get Regina templum forma pulcherrima, the queen to her temple, most beautiful in form, that she's this gorgeous woman, Dido. And what that does for us, the poetic effect that has on us, is it builds this anticipation within the line that we don't even know. Maybe this is Juno, Regina templum, the queen coming to her temple. Well, this is a temple to Juno, the queen of the gods. Is this the queen herself coming? That would be bad, right? That would be a terrible thing for Aeneas to encounter this goddess who hates him. And so we get this sense of foreboding, we get the sense of danger, and then it turns out not to be that queen, but the queen, the mortal queen of this human place, which is Dido. And that might cause us to feel relief, except that we know there's all of this danger, all this menace, all of this allure that is waiting still in the background. So masterful use of hyperbaton, where you delay a word so that the meaning of the sentence only becomes clear as the sentence goes on. And that means the reason it's called hyperbaton is because you have to you have to baton step hyper over the intervening words to get to the meaning, and enjambment, where the sentence goes across the line. Here's the best that I can do at translating this. Some of these things can never be captured fully in translation because English has to do a certain word order in order to get the meaning across. Latin doesn't have to do that. You can put the words in any order you want in Latin because all of the grammatical information is contained within the cases and the forms of the verbs. There are some limitations to this, but there's a lot more freedom in Latin with that. And that's because Latin is what's called an inflectional language. It has all of this kind of grammatical power within the words so that you can rearrange the words however you want. Not so in English. And that's one of the things that makes English hard as a language to use to translate. Virgil, here's my best attempt at translating the entrance onto the scene of Dido. In queenly state and with surpassing beauty, Dido strode toward the temple with a throng of men, her young attendants. It was much the same as when, along the banks of the Eurotas or the ridges of Mount Cynthus, where Diana orchestrates, a crowded chorus of 1,000 mountain nymphs amass on every side as she proceeds, and she, her quiver on her shoulder, walks preeminent among the many goddesses, while silent joy throbs in the ribcage of Latona looking on. Dido was like that. That was how she moved, in bliss amid the crowds, and spurred the labor of her kingdom on. It is a sublime. This is Virgil at his absolute best, in my opinion, because he gives you a classic Homeric simile. We've talked a lot about Homeric similes when we did Homer. The Greek word hos, which means like, will always introduce, or will often introduce, this long image that kind of draws you out of the action and gives you a comparison to it. And here in Latin, it's qualis, just as when, like when. And from Dido, the queen, who we just thought might be Juno, might be the queen of goddesses, who maybe is sort of associated with Venus, the goddess of love, turns out instead to be Diana, the goddess of the hunt, the virgin goddess. And so all of that is bound up here and packaged as we get this luxuriant, beautiful image of Dido in state. Very beautiful, very chaste, very virginal, all of those things, and yet with all this other stuff in the background. Nothing is as it seems. There is danger here, there's allure here, there's desire. She is the consummate Cleopatra, even as she is the consummate Dido and the consummate Diana. Just masterful. Dido strode toward the temple with a throng of men, her young attendants. There's something incredibly sexy about it, even though it is also very, very demure, as the kids say. I mean, really, I could read this passage over and over again. And there's a lot in Virgil that is kind of like this. But here she is. She's appeared. The next thing Virgil does is sit her down and have her administer justice just like a king. And so what we're being asked to wonder here is, how is this queen, this magnificent, majestic head of state, this ruler of the wealthy Phoenicians who have established such an amazing civilization in so short a time, how is this queen going to be brought low by Aeneas, the schlub? And the answer to that question we will pick up with next time, when we begin to embark upon the love affair between Dido and Aeneas, which has inspired operas and paintings and knockoffs and spin-offs and stories for centuries and centuries, and will continue to do so. It is one of the great love affairs, and this is the setup that Virgil gives us. It's a fantastic lead up to what is going to be a very, very dramatic story. I'm just going to note here, we don't have time to really get into it. We'll deal with it a little bit more later, but this picture of Dido as the regal queen, as the leader, as the almost masculine force, who also nevertheless has all this sex appeal, that picture is going to become worked into the image of Cleopatra, which itself has, of course, become iconically famous. Just a little bit later, just a little bit after Virgil, you get Plutarch's Life of Antony, which gives you a picture of Cleopatra on a boat that becomes famous ever afterwards. This is on the river Cydnus. She shows up in a barge with purple sails and rowers all around her with their oars, and these young kind of cherubic boys attending her, and perfumes and desire and all this stuff. And that's the picture of Cleopatra that is both influencing Dido, and now after Virgil is going to influence depictions. Dido is going to influence Cleopatra. So there's this kind of literary circle going on where Dido is Cleopatra, but then Cleopatra is going to be depicted as Dido, and it all snowballs down the line until we get to Shakespeare, in a passage you may know very, very well from Antony and Cleopatra. If you've read any Shakespeare, you might know Antony and Cleopatra. The barge she sat in like a burnished throne, this depiction which I will read in full next time of Cleopatra in Shakespeare. So all of that to come, just a little note to say that this picture that Virgil gives us of Dido is tremendously influential in world literature and in the writing of history. And he's doing both here. He's giving us Dido, the mythic figure, Dido, the tragic heroine, Dido, the lovely and almost virginal queen, but also Dido, the femme fatale, Dido, the alluring Cleopatra, Dido, the danger trap that Aeneas is about to walk into as these books proceed. that's the subject really of the core of books 1 and really 1 through 4, I would say, have this motif running through them, and they are a central part of what has made this poem so famous. Kind of the core of this opening section is this encounter with Dido and Aeneas. We'll get into that more down the line, but first, a mailbag. Mailbag questions come to me on Substack. I've already mentioned rejoiceevermore.substack.com, where you can write into me. I do a weekly essay. I do extra content for paid subscribers. I'm sort of toying with the idea of writing a translation of the Aeneid for paid subscribers, like just a full thing, because it's been so fun. That's another thing I'd love to know if you're interested in that and if you would pay to sign up. And, I probably can't do it for free, but if a lot of people subscribe for my paid content on rejoiceevermore.substack.com, maybe I can do a full Aeneid translation. Would you be interested in that? Let me know. But also write in with mailbag questions. And that is what Dan has done here, to ask me a question of all things about Wicked, the musical, which I've now talked about surprisingly often on the show. And I actually think that this question relates very closely to a lot of what we've been talking about with the Virgil and the Aeneid series. But it's funny that these two threads, the kind of modern pop culture stuff and the ancient literature stuff, have been going on at once. And Dan asks a question that I think actually ties them together really nicely. Dan, like me, I think, is a theater kid. He's a musical theater nerd. And he has asked me a question about my comments on Wicked, because I said that Wicked as a story kind of annoys me in that it's another one of these stories where the bad guy turns out to be the good guy. We have a lot of these, and I find them sort of subversive. I think that they tend to suggest that there is no such thing as a bad guy, there's no such thing as evil, everybody's really just misunderstood, all of that, blah, blah, blah. But Dan asks, do you really hate subversion narratives? No doubt the trope is easily used cheaply, and it falls flat when it does. But isn't that because when it's done well, it hits hard? Don't forget that the Theotokos, that is the Virgin Mary, gave us the first and best subversion narrative. The trope does tend in a leftward direction, so I get the frustration with all the, well, actually the hero was a misogynist takes, but that doesn't mean there aren't status quo that need to be subvertive, and it seems that right-leaning folks have been enjoying quite a lot of mask-off subversion stories over the past era of the culture war. Okay, cool. So the idea of Wicked, Dan is saying, the idea of the musical Wicked is, you've been told one story about the Wicked Witch of the West, but actually another story is true. It's actually Glinda who was sort of morally questionable. It's actually the wizard who was the villain, and they only used Elphaba, the Wicked Witch, as a sort of stand-in for their evil and their villainy. And there are many, many examples of this kind of story that I've been kind of down on and kind of hard on. But, says Dan, isn't Christianity kind of the ultimate subversion narrative? The idea that the world is upside down, that Caesar, who seems strong, is really weak, that the proud will fall and be humbled, that the poor are wealthy in spirit, all of this stuff. Blessed are the poor. I would even say not just the Magnificat, which is what Dan is talking about, the Song of Mary, but even the Sermon on the Mount is kind of a subversion narrative. I think C.S. Lewis at one point calls it like a rebellion from within the fallen kingdom. The true king comes back to overturn the wicked empire. This is a very smart and interesting question, and I think it shows, one thing it shows is how much stories like Wicked are influenced by Christianity without even knowing it. This idea that Christianity gives us, this sort of explosive idea that the world actually is broken and that there's a secret knowledge that has to overturn the established order of things. It's so ingrained in us that we love stories about how it turns out actually the bad guys are in charge and the good guys are the ones that are called the bad guys. And I think that, Dan, you're onto something, but I also think multiple things can be true at once. There are subversion narratives. There are stories of reversal that obviously get at some truth. In fact, we do live in a world where often there is injustice, and often we have to discover that what the world says is one way actually turns out to be the other. Our regime calls good evil, but we have to call evil good. And I would say that, like, the sort of trans kid maximalism would be a good example of this for conservatives, right? The idea that like all of the major institutions are saying it's stunning and brave for children who are confused about their sex to like take drugs and maybe get surgery and all that. And that's this dominant moral narrative that totally needs to be overthrown because it's the opposite of true. It's actually bad for that to happen. And what we actually need is counseling and therapy and all of that stuff. So it's not like that's not a reality sometimes, and it can happen. I would say two things. First of all, and Dan, you hinted this in your letter, just because that can be the case doesn't mean that all moral frameworks are inverted and need to be overthrown. And it can be true that one moral framework is wrong and bad without it being true that all moral frameworks are wrong and bad. And what I dislike, I think, about our modern subversion narratives is they tend to either imply or just say outright that because sometimes moralists make mistakes, therefore morality is itself a con, is just an op, and doesn't really pertain to anything real. And the way that they typically do this is by telling you a gotcha story or a role reversal story about a fairy tale. And the reason it's usually fairy tales is this. In fairy tales, and I would say also in theological parables and often in scripture, the moral framework of the universe that makes the Wicked Witch wicked isn't presented as a set of claims. It's presented as a basic sort of given fact of the universe. So in fairy tales, when you say there was a wicked witch, what you're really saying is there's a world, like our world, where there is good and evil. And this was one of the good guys, and this was one of the bad guys. This wicked witch was bad. And so you actually can't overturn that without reversing the entire moral structure of the universe that is depicted in that story. When you overturn that structure, when you say that the monster was actually the good guy in Beowulf, when you say that the wicked witch was actually virtuous, what you're really saying is all categories of good and evil in this story need to either be erased or reversed. And that's an actually different thing than saying there is good and evil, but they've been misidentified in this and that particular case, which I think is actually what the gospel says. The gospel does not say this guy you've been taught to call God is actually a villain. Because when you talk about God as good, you're really talking about goodness in itself. And if you were to say God is actually the bad guy, he's actually evil, he's actually oppressive, then you would be upending the moral framework of the universe. Instead, the Gospels take the moral framework of the universe for granted and then rearrange the human assignment of good and evil within that framework. And I actually think that's a fundamentally different thing than to rearrange the framework of the universe itself. And usually when you take a fairy tale and you then tell the backstory and you subvert the narrative and you kind of undermine the moral contours of the narrative, usually what you end up doing is rejiggering the actual scaffolding of the moral universe, not the placing of particular individuals within that scaffolding. And the kind of gesture that a story like Wicked does is actually much less close to the gesture of the Gospels and much more close to the gesture of Gnosticism. Gnosticism is the OG version of the kind of subversion I'm talking about, where it turns out the God of the Old Testament is actually the bad guy. He's actually evil. He's actually this villain called Yaldabaoth in disguise. That's what the Gnostic Gospels are all about. And many of our narratives in the modern day have a Gnostic character to them in this way. I'm thinking, for example, of His Dark Materials by Philip Pullman, where it turns out that the entity we have called God for all of history is actually an imposter who's just trying to disguise the fact that dust, this weird atomic substance, is really what creates the universe. And it's just a natural phenomenon, and all of it happens through rational laws and all of that. And that's a Gnostic idea, because what it says is, the God that we've referred to throughout history, and therefore most of our traditions, most of our wisdom literature, most of that's all a sham. That's all a lie. And what's real is either the opposite of that or nothing. Either there's just a kind of void through which the atoms move. So His Dark Materials is a good example of this. I think Wicked kind of flirts with that idea a lot. There's a show called Has Been Hotel, which is a cartoon, I think, based on a graphic novel that is very much about this, the idea that Satan was actually the good guy. William Blake thought this about Paradise Lost, although I think he was wrong. There's a lot of examples of this, and it's actually something different from the Christian idea that the human order of society needs to be overturned or reversed, because that reversal takes place within an ironclad moral universe that preserves the truth that God is good and preserves our idea of God throughout history as having basically been valid. It's just that now within that idea, we need to realize that it applies differently than we thought to the particular facts of the world that we are living in. So that's the distinction that I would draw. And I think it's a very deeply ingrained and profound distinction that kind of reveals a lot of what's going on. Now, Gnosticism can be artistically interesting. Just because I'm saying all of these things about His Dark Materials doesn't mean that it's not a good book series. I actually think it's a pretty well done book series. I just think that when you pull back the camera and you ask about its philosophy, you realize that it either makes no sense or is kind of evil. And that's basically my assessment of The Golden Compass and The Amber Spyglass and whatever, is that, look, I liked those books. I really enjoyed them. I even enjoyed the TV adaptation that they did recently. But when you actually look at what it's saying, it doesn't make any sense at all. Or if it does make sense, then it leaves us in a howling void of moral incomprehension where all acts are just as good as all other acts, which I think is bad. I don't think you should do that, is the moral of my answer here to this mailbag question. Probably don't pull the rug out from underneath the moral universe. If you want to mess around with the way that certain stories have been told, very, very normal thing to do. Happens in Virgil, for instance. And this is why this question about Wicked is related to Epic, because Epic also does this, right? Virgil will take Venus and will recast her in a different set of roles so that we think a little bit differently about her and say, actually, Homer got it kind of wrong, and the way it really was this way. That's different from saying there was no Venus ever, Zeus is actually the devil, and in fact, everything that we call moral in Homer is actually immoral, right? That's the Gnostic idea. The more canonical, classical thing is to play around with the parts within the universe, not to explode the universe itself, but to recast the roles and to suggest different timelines within the universe. All right, great, juicy mailbag question. Thank you, Dan. Thank you, everyone, for listening. One more time, don't forget to subscribe and rate the show 5 stars. Let people know about it. I will see you next time for more truth, beauty, and the stuff that matters.